A media firestorm over cruel and wasteful animal experiments funded by the U.S. and in a foreign country. It could be just the thing that bridges the divide in America. In politics, the new common ground may be saving the animals. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Kathy Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights, brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. We know how divided the U.S. is currently in almost all ways, politically, socially, but maybe the best chance of bringing us together are the animals. This week, conservative media picked up the story of a strange experiment funded by the U.S. government's National Institutes of Health involving beagles and sandflies, and all taking place in Tunisia. The story sparked outrage because it involved a lab under Dr. Anthony Fauci. It wasn't conservative propaganda, it was real. In fact, PETA has led the charge to expose that and other expensive and useless experiments at NIH. And in spite of our political class having difficulty getting together on issues like infrastructure funding, both the right and left seem to have found a soft spot in their hearts for the animals. It's providing some common ground that not only could help bridge the divide in American politics, it could bring on the changes needed at the National Institutes of Health to bring an end to the billions of dollars spent on cruel and unnecessary animal tests. Here's Kathy Guillermo, PETA's Senior VP on Laboratory Investigations, on the PETA Podcast.
The story that has hit the news and the public attention is about a series of experiments on dogs funded by the National Institutes of Health, and specifically Anthony Fauci's institute, the National Institute on Allergy and Infectious Diseases. It's several different experiments, one of which involves dogs in Tunisia who are made to endure the repeated bites of sand fleas while their heads are trapped inside mesh cages. Other experiments involve vaccine experiments done on beagles at University of Georgia. Still others involve the cutting of the vocal cords of beagle dogs at a laboratory in California. And it has caught the attention of the country because people don't tend to think of modern research as involving cutting dogs' vocal cords or making them endure thousands of bites of fleas. But it's only the very tip of the iceberg of what NIH is funding.
So what you're saying is this is pretty normal in terms of what NIH does. PETA's been talking for years about these, I don't want to call them baloney experiments, but these experiments that really do little to help the general public and do little to further science.
That's right. And we've been ending these experiments for years. And most recently, we had decided that if we were going to see good science embraced, and by good science, I'm talking about organs on a chip and supercomputers and clinical studies and epidemiological studies that have a chance of helping human beings, and not the experiments on animals, which we know don't. But most recently, we called for the resignation of NIH Director Francis Collins. We began that call in July. And by September, fortunately, he had decided that he was going to step down at the end of the year. But the reason we took that drastic step was that this is going on such a massive scale. Hundreds of thousands of animals, hundreds of millions of dollars, incredible pain and suffering, and a complete failure of a research institute that is supposed to be bringing us cures and vaccines.
Now, it just seems to me that when you talk about the enormity of the problems, we're really talking about hundreds of thousands of animals whose lives are lost due to these experiments, and we're talking about not millions, but billions of dollars being wasted because of NIH's direction?
Yes, NIH is the premier funder of animal experimentation in the United States, and they fund a number of studies overseas as well. They have a budget of $41 billion, and in case I need to remind anybody, that's our tax money that they're playing with. With half of that, they fund experiments on animals. So about $19 billion, billion with a B, are going to experiments on animals. Now, one reason that's so reprehensible is ethical. It's simply wrong to take these animals' lives as though they belong to us and to use them for our own purposes. But the other part of it is scientific, because we've known for a decade that 90% of this basic research that NIH funds, most of it involving animals, fails entirely to lead to treatments for human beings. So this is cruel, it's unethical, it's an incredible waste of money, and people who are waiting for treatments and cures and vaccines are going to wait a lot longer unless things change.
Now, Pete has been harping on this issue for a long, long time. And even here on the PETA podcast, we've talked about the situation with the Washington Primate Research Center. Talk about what was recently done to expose what they do and how they're funded by NIH.
The Arizona Republic recently exposed that the Washington National Primate Research Center, funded by NIH, located at the University of Washington in Seattle, is breeding animals at their Arizona facility who are sick with valley fever and a variety of other ailments. And they're taking these animals and they're shipping them, sometimes illegally with improper paperwork, from Arizona to Seattle. And even though experimenters there know that because these monkeys are sick, any data they collect is not going to be worth anything, they continue to do these experiments. Now, we're not really talking about any experiments that would even save anybody's lives, even if the data were good. We're talking about total body irradiation of monkeys. We're talking about taking the tops of the skulls off of monkeys and poking around in their brains while they stare at a screen to see what happens when they poke a certain part of the brain and the monkey is playing with the little video control and staring at a screen. These are not things that are going to help human beings, and they cause immense pain for the animals involved.
And really, this was one major expose by the Arizona Republic and the USA Today network in conjunction with PETA scientists who really unearthed all these records. But this is really, as you've said, it's just one of many instances that show what NIH is not doing what should be in the public interest.
Well, let's take a look inside NIH's own laboratories. In 2020, PETA first released video of the experiments of Elizabeth Murray. She is an experimenter who uses monkeys and supposedly is studying neuropsychiatric disorders. We obtained this video through FOIA. We had to fight for it, and we were the first ones to release it. And it showed that Elizabeth Murray cuts the tops off the skulls of these rhesus macaques. She damages a portion of their brain with a chemical, and then she puts them in tiny cages and she scares the heck out of them. She does this with a variety of implements, usually plastic snakes and spiders, which the monkeys fear. This has been going on for 30 years. It's cost taxpayers at least $47 million. We don't have anything from it. We don't have anything that would help human beings in the slightest. And if you go to PETA.org, you can see the video of one of her victims, a monkey called Beamish, who is 16 years old and who has been living inside Elizabeth Murray's laboratory in a tiny cage by himself for more than a decade.
Now, is this what some people might call junk science, or is it merely just bad science, or is it kind of like the welfare state for researchers who are looking for a paycheck?
All of the above. It's junk science, it's bad science, and it's a way for an experimenter to get a paycheck and to publish papers. But it is completely useless. Now, a few years ago, we exposed the laboratory of Stephen Sumi at NIH down the hall from Elizabeth Murray. And Sumi was taking infant monkeys from their mothers when they were just a day or two old, sometimes at birth, and inducing mental illness by the way that he treated them. And then he would frighten the heck out of them in various ways that you can frighten a baby monkey. And he had been doing this for 30 years. It took us 2 years, but we shut that laboratory down. And we expected, frankly, a review of the monkey experiments at NIH after this. So it was startling to find Elizabeth Murray's horrors in her laboratory there. And we're working very hard to get that shut down too.
Well, these are all examples of what NIH has done throughout the years. PETA has exposed them, and yet they still continue to happen at NIH. What is the issue now, or what? I mean, it just seems that suddenly people have noticed the dog story. It's no different from what NIH has been doing all the years.
Well, and people do notice stories all along. There were, there were millions of people and hundreds of people who called NIH, but millions of people who saw our video, and tens of thousands of people who have taken action on our website about the Sumi experiments. Hundreds of people in just the last week have called NIH about Elizabeth Murray. So the dog experiments are one piece of a much larger piece. And I think what the problem is that we see now is that we have a health agency that is stuck in an old-fashioned scientific paradigm. Fortunately, we have a solution. We call it the Research Modernization Deal. And we need right now, more than ever, for President Biden to appoint a new director of NIH, as Francis Collins leaves at the end of this year, who is going to embrace the Research Modernization Deal, who's going to stop the experiments that are utter failures, phase out the rest of them, and get us somewhere where we need to be scientifically and certainly ethically too.
Now, talk about the Research Modernization Deal. And is it a political thing? What does it say? How does it change science in America?
It's so common sense. And yet I think that's what we need here. And what we've been told by people inside NIH quietly is that until there's a leadership change, we won't see it. But think about what we know. As I mentioned earlier, we know about the failure of animal experiments to lead to treatments and cures. And we know this because scientists have done reviews of all the animal studies in certain areas of research. For example, in sepsis, we know that sepsis, which is a leading killer of Americans, the disease is different in animals. So when a drug is developed in an animal and then tried on a human, it doesn't work. That's happened 150 times. And yet NIH continues to spend money on sepsis research on animals. We know that for stroke medication, for example, 1,000 stroke drugs developed in animals have failed in humans. So our Research Modernization Deal says, for those areas where we know animal experiments have failed, and we outline them in some detail, for those areas, stop funding animal experiments immediately. Put that money toward proven, modern, cutting-edge science that's going to take us somewhere.
Cutting-edge science means experiments without animals.
It does. It means the organs on a chip that we've heard so much about, three-dimensional tissue models, the supercomputers that can take data from information about a drug, for example, that might be tested on humans and predict how it's going to affect the different organs of a human. There are so many other ways that are directly relevant, because we have to remember that testing something on an animal does not make it safe for humans. The 81% of drugs that were tested on animals failed to show side effects for humans. So it can be just as dangerous and deadly, even if it's tested on an animal first. We need to get that information about what's going to happen from a human or in a human in better ways.
Now, the basis for that has been out there for, a few years. People know that animal tests are not effective. It's a different species when you want to apply it to a human being. And yet these kinds of things persist. Is it a generational thing, a generational mindset that is hindering NIH and hindering really American research science?
Well, it's hard to say entirely that it's generational. I think what we have here is the failure of NIH Director Francis Collins to remember that the American public is his constituency, because he seems to believe that animal experimenters are, and he seems to believe that he has to placate them. So we have his refusal to end experiments that we know are utterly ridiculous, like Elizabeth Murray's monkey fried experiments, like the 7 national primate research centers, which suck up money and kill monkeys in horrible ways. We have his refusal to act on those. We're also hampered by the review process at NIH. When somebody sends in a proposal for funding for an experiment, it is reviewed by people who oftentimes are themselves animal experimenters. We need some new blood in there. We need some new ideas, and we need to bring in people who have expertise in non-animal methods, who can weigh in and say, all right, well, we studied this for 25 years in rats or dogs or hamsters or cats, and we are nowhere. So it's time to shut that down.
Now, you pointed out that you got to bring this to President Biden, and you want President Biden to call for this new Research Modernization Deal. And it seems to me that from the sounds of it, it should be a bipartisan issue, and it should be something that should easily pass. But we know that in Washington, something that's easily passed is, you don't see that often, because the partisanship is a reality in Washington. Is this, say, an issue that could bring all sides together?
I think it already has. Just 2 weeks ago, we were present at the announcement of legislation introduced in the Senate called the FDA Modernization Act, which would give the FDA authority to approve drugs that had not been tested in animals. And that bill was introduced by Senator Cory Booker and Senator Rand Paul. So we had people on the extremes of both parties. And we see this more and more. Animal rights is not a partisan issue. PETA is neither a liberal nor a conservative organization. Our membership is about equally divided between both. And that's as it should be, because we're all human beings. So I do think that this is an area where Congress is coming together more than ever before, or more than on any other topic.
And it seems that the conservative media has glommed onto this story, and they have sort of fanned the flames. PETA's been out there for years exposing these experiments, but here now they seem to find maybe an anti-Fauci angle. Is that what they like, or is it really a pro-animal approach?
Oh, it's probably a little bit of both. But I have to say that one of the huge disappointments in the media is the bias, what I perceive as a bias on the part of mainstream media, such as NPR, to some degree, the New York Times. We have mainstream media organizations that are refusing to consider that there's a valid point to be made here. They're refusing to look at the evidence. And in some cases, most notably in the Washington Post today, they're even getting the information about the dog experiments wrong and defending it on that basis. So it is very much a problem for the American public not to have this story told by all media, no matter what leaning they have politically.
Now, one of the things about NIH in particular, and what makes it kind of interesting here, is that, as you said, they get funded to the tune of about $40 billion. And it just seems like people don't seem to be paying attention. What do you think is going to change that?
I think we have an opportunity now like we haven't had in 10 years. Francis Collins was appointed by President Obama to head the National Institutes of Health. And when he came into that position, he was one of the leading proponents of shifting to a new direction. He acknowledged that experiments on animals, the basic research that NIH funds, is not translating to treatments for human beings. And he said he was going to change that. He has not. So he knows what the issue is, and he has failed. But now we have an opportunity to bring a new person in to head up this agency. We have gone to President Biden. In fact, we have dinosaurs on the streets at all of his stops in the coming weeks. And we have dinosaurs because we need to get the dinosaur out of NIH and bring in new blood. But we have been asking President Biden to make sure that he appoints leadership at NIH who is going to take us in this new direction that we have to go.
And if that happens, what kind of change can people in American society expect? What kind of real change could happen if everything you'd like to see happen at NIH does occur?
If more money were put into the existing non-animal methods, and there are so many of them, then we would begin to see what we saw with the development of the COVID vaccine. Now, I don't want to mislead. The COVID vaccines were tested on animals, but they were developed without animals. They were developed from theories that scientists put together, and they were then at that point tested on animals because that's required by law. But the animals weren't needed in this process. And that's what's key here. And think how fast we got a COVID vaccine. Yet how many decades have we waited for a vaccine to prevent HIV? That's the kind of change we could see.
Because, a lot of people would say, well, look, don't we need all these experiments? Because when you cut off all these experiments that people know about or are experienced with, you might cut off that chance that, that finding, won't happen now because you've forced them to go in another direction.
Well, the hard data says otherwise. We know 90% failure of animal experiments, basic research to lead to treatments for humans. We know the 95%, at least 95% failure rate of new drugs developed in animals in human beings. Then they fail. So it's hard to ignore what is very plainly in front of us right now. It's failing. Now, it's true that probably along the way, some things were developed in animals that have been beneficial to human. And I think of it this way. If you've got a little tiny hole in the wall and you're trying to get a ping pong ball through it, if you shoot 100,000 ping pong balls at it, one of them is bound to get through. That's really what we're seeing. Right now, we're shooting $19 billion and millions of animal lives at it, and we're still waiting.
And so, Kathy, how soon before, say, the Research Modernization Deal gets much traction? And I would think that if Francis Collins has announced that he is going to leave by the end of the year, it should be fairly quickly. And that should be a signal to everyone about the direction the Biden administration wants the NIH to go.
It should be. And I will say the Research Modernization Deal has had tremendous traction already. Our listeners may know that the European Parliament just voted overwhelmingly in favor of directing the European Commission to develop a plan to phase out the use of animals in all areas of experimentation. And they did this after they reviewed our Research Modernization Deal. So it has had tremendous traction already globally. It's being considered in India now too. What we need is the US Congress to catch up. And we are in discussions with members of Congress, and we do have quite a bit of support. So I'm very hopeful. They know what it is, they know why it's important, and they're tired of these kinds of ridiculous experiments, one after another, that are released and expose the agency for what it is.
I've been observing this for some time, and it always seems to me that the one bipartisan issue that seems to bring both sides together are the animals, safety of the animals. What is your hope that this may be the one issue that might bridge some of the divide that exists in our country?
Well, my hope is that people will look at the facts, that they will get in touch with their members of Congress and ask them to support the Research Modernization Deal, whether you're Republican, Democrat, or anything else, and that the members of Congress will listen. We know they'll work together on this issue because we see it all the time now. I also think Congress needs to make very clear to President Biden that this is a priority, that we don't want the status quo anymore, because the status quo is giving us bad science. So it's most important for Americans to get in touch with their representatives, to get in touch with President Biden, which they can do through our site. And to answer your question briefly, it's my hope that this is the beginning of the end of all use of animals in experiments.
PETA Senior VP of Laboratory Investigations, Kathy Guillermo. Once again, you can take action. Tell the Biden administration to overhaul and modernize NIH and useless animal experimentation. Go to PETA.org on how you can take action. that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to send a link of this show to your friends. Tell them you like the PETA Podcast. Contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok. That's EMIL-AMOK. Or see my vlog at AMOK.com. Or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to as well as rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbonworks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.